Hello, my name is Susan Gent, and I represent Ames Public Library, which connects you to the world of ideas. This program is another example of our mission in practice. Thank you for watching this recording of Facing Facts, the truth about fake news and what to do about it, which was recorded on Saturday, September 12, 2020. Our partners include the Iowa State University Graduate Students of Psychology and faculty from the Iowa State University Greenlee School of Journalism and Communication, who will be introduced throughout the course of this presentation. The original event included case studies which were discussed in small groups after presentations by our partners. In this recording, my colleague Ebby will walk through those 4 case studies so that you too will have a chance to practice the media literacy tools explained by our experts. They'll also help make the follow-up discussion more relevant. Now we'll pick up with Ebby as she explains how and why this program developed.
In addition to offering programming books and other media and thinking about how this program was developed, Ames Public Library is a resource that community members regularly contact for fact-checking and reliable and trustworthy information on a variety of topics. Free access to accurate and up-to-date information is not only foundational to libraries' guiding principles, but it is essential to the healthy functioning and preservation of a democratic society. It is from that understanding that today's workshop was born, from our desire to enhance our support of civic engagement in our community by sharing effective tools and strategies to help people engage with news, media, and other information resources critically and successfully in an age where objective truth has become harder to recognize. We teamed up with the ISU Greenlee School of Journalism and ISU graduate students in psychology to do just that. We hope that the information you gain today will help you to navigate our ever-shifting media landscape and become better informed about the things that matter most to you. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first presenter for the day, Julie Rosa. Julie Rosa is the First Amendment Specialist at Iowa State University, Greenlee School of Journalism and Communication. Her position is devoted to improving understanding about the First Amendment and involves outreach, training, and teaching. She earned a law degree and a master's degree from Drake University, where she focused on the First Amendment, constitutional law, civil rights, media law, and journalism. She earned a bachelor's degree from Iowa State University in journalism. Welcome, Julie, and thank you for joining us today. I'm going to turn my camera off and hand it over.
I just was saying thank you, everybody, for being here and spending part of your kind of bright Saturday afternoon with us on this really important topic. Here with me today at home is Bitsy in the background here, so my dog likes to listen and learn as well. With that being said, if you'll give me just a moment, I'm going to share my screen and move over into what I'd like to share with you today. So hopefully everyone can see now what's on the screen. And let me tell you just a moment, just for a minute here, about how our workshop today will work. What we're planning to do is really present this workshop in 3 parts. The first part will be a series of mini lectures that will cover 1, an overview of so-called fake news and the importance of doing our own fact checking. 2, a focus on the visual side of misinformation. 3, the role psychology plays in our media literacy. And 4, how mindfulness can improve our media consumption experience. All right, from there we'll move into the breakout rooms that Ebby mentioned. And there you'll be able to apply some of what the mini presentations or the mini lectures have shared with you. Okay, those breakout rooms will be facilitated by our fantastic lineup of psychology students, graduate level, I might add, from the ISU psychology department. After that, we'll come back together, we'll debrief, and then we'll have time for questions as well. Now, I want to say, as a side note, despite the amount of time you are agreeing to spend with us this afternoon, we recognize that we still have not really scratched the surface of this very important topic. And we hope to be able to continue the conversation. But for now, we are covering what we think is an interesting mix of dialogue regarding fake news and what to do about it. We thought this was enough for today. So with that, let's get started. Here we go. So, and I am going to mute my here to help with the bandwidth. My objectives with you today, everybody, is to provide that overview that I mentioned. I also want to give an election warning because part of the timing of this workshop is directly related to the election we have coming here in less than 2 months. Then I want to give a recruiting pitch, if I may, to enlist the audience in helping us become our own fact checkers. And finally, we'll have some time for some questions and answers. Let's get started. All right, here are some breaking news that came across my Twitter feed yesterday, really just this morning, that I think really demonstrates to this very issue of misinformation and why it matters, not just to news consumers, but to all of us as citizens. This was a tweet by the FBI in Portland regarding the fires that are happening there even as we speak. And for those who may not be able to see the screen as well as they might like, I'll just read the tweet to you. FBI Portland and local law enforcement agencies have been receiving reports that extremists are responsible for setting wildfires in Oregon. With our state and local partners, the FBI has investigated several such reports and found them to be untrue, emphasis. Second part of the tweet, conspiracy theories and misinformation take valuable resources away, take away local fire and police agencies working around the clock to bring these fires under control. Please help our entire community by only sharing validated information from official sources. So here we have it in a nutshell, the issue of misinformation and how dangerous it can be to our society. Let's start with a poll here, bringing it back to our own community. Hopefully, we'll be able to launch this poll and you can respond to this question. Have you ever shared news on social media? Let me just assume that for many of you, that you have in fact shared information on your social media feed. For many of us, it's very common with what we do. And in the next slide, I'll show you some statistics related to that. The second question that I would like you to kind of think about is, have you ever shared information on social media that turned out to be false or inaccurate? And again, just kind of thinking through that question. Your results may very well be similar to some of the national statistics. So let me share that with you here on the screen, if we can get it back to the screen. Are we back in the PowerPoint? Can someone chat me and say yes or no?
You're good.
Okay. Sorry about that. So here we are back into some of these statistics. When it comes to misinformation, we want to bear in mind that 68% of us, so more than 2/3, now get our news from social media, at least on occasion. So we see that number rising over the years in terms of where people go for sources of news. All right. In addition, 52% of us who said that we get our news from social media have acknowledged that they have actually shared, quote, made up news. So they've shared something that was false or inaccurate. And they did that either knowingly or even unknowingly. So that's a key statistic. Over half of us have shared made up news before, and that is a part of the reason we're here today. Yet, listen to this, we estimate that most of what we're seeing on social media is inaccurate or misinformation, especially as it relates to information about politics and the elections, where even more of us believe that that information is probably false or incorrect. Okay, and then even more staggering is this idea that almost all of us have come across made up news intended to mislead the public, posted on social media. So with that as our foundation, we know that using social media both to share news and receive news is frankly a regular habit now in our society, yet we think it is plagued with misinformation. Why do we use social media nowadays? Well, it's convenient, it's quick, and it's social. We like the idea of meeting out there on the internet together and sharing information. Why else? With the reality of using social media for news, our news habits have changed, right? It used to be that a newspaper would be delivered once per day. So those working for the newspaper would have one deadline to meet. Now that 24/7 news cycle is the reality for news organizations. So we are constantly updating information, and we as a citizenry are constantly trying to find that updated information. What else about our news habits? Well, free has replaced paid subscriptions. Do you realize that only 20% of us are actually willing to write a check and subscribe to the news that we get online? The vast majority prefer free, and sometimes when you prefer free, you get what you pay for. There are fewer reporters out there doing the work that we used to rely on reporters to do, and there are fewer newsrooms for that to happen. And so the reality is that as we see shrinking jobs for the media and fewer newsrooms for those reporters to work in, we have less resources. So we're turning to social media to fill that gap. Reporters don't make as much money as the talking heads that dominate the airwaves. And we don't do our own fact checking. 70% of us are likely to retweet false news without checking it first. And I saw in the chat that a couple of our participants were sharing that we do our best to try to check it before we share it. And thank you for that. The reality is that many, many more of us don't do that. Also, we don't read past the headlines. So it used to be when that newspaper would land on our step, we'd pull it out and read it, sometimes cover to cover, other times important information that we want to zero in on. But nowadays, a lot of times with these headlines that come across our social media feeds, they're just so tempting to share those without actually clicking into the story. So that becomes important as well. Also, this idea of media bias has changed our news consumption habits. And I have a slide for you in the next click to show you that. Lastly, why do we turn to social media so much and rely on it for our news? Well, this idea of confirmation bias and other psychological reasons that another colleague of mine is going to share with you a little bit later on in today's discussion. Here's that chart that I wanted to show you. Bias in the media, frankly, is really as old as the printing press. But the difference is today, it's not acknowledged in the same way. Many news organizations say they're unbiased, but sometimes the reality, it doesn't match that. And so there's a website that we're not going to spend time on today, but I encourage you to take a look at that has tried to rank the level of bias within some of our most common news sites that we rely on for news. So that's important to check out. The other issue that comes into play is actually the term fake news. What is fake news? Well, in a way, nobody knows anymore. It used to be that fake news was used to define this narrow, small set of websites that intentionally pump out fabricated stories for laughs, clicks, and other reasons that we may never understand. So, not that long ago, fact checkers would refer to fake news with respect to what is really fake news, information that is intentionally false. But today, to quote David Mickelson, the Snopes founder, information doesn't necessarily have to be fake or false to qualify as fake news. And indeed, I did a quick Google search, and using the term fake news, there were 860 million hits on that term. So clearly, fake news no longer is reserved for actual websites that are fake. In addition, I mean, the statistics prove this out. Most of us agree false information that is portrayed as true deserves to be called fake news. But look at this next statistic on my slide. 79% say that accurate stories, let me say that again, accurate stories portraying politicians in a negative light sometimes or always constitute fake news. So there we have it, this idea that this term doesn't really mean what it used to and doesn't seem to mean what it should. So my takeaway from this and my encouragement to you is, let's stop using the term fake news when it doesn't fit the reality of what we're talking about. The Pew Research Center uses misinformation as the term that probably better captures what we're talking about here. Okay, so that's an overview about the issue surrounding this idea of getting news from our social media feeds, and also the belief that much of that information is misinformation. Let me now bring into the discussion this election warning that I mentioned. We have less than 2 months before our election is scheduled to take place. Look at what happened in the time just before the 2016 election. In the 3 months before that election happened, false news actually outperformed news from our major news outlets. So if you look at the number on your screen there, false election stories generated 1.5 million more shares, reactions, comments, etc., than election stories from what I would define as our reliable news networks. Okay, and this makes sense when you think about it. Back at that time as well, in 2016, 25% of Americans visited a fake news website. 1 in 4 of us visited sites that were fake. And that's easy to understand when you look at the volume of false or fake websites that are created to try to intervene with our elections. And then sadly, just as a side note, users over 65 years of age tend to share more often articles from fake news domains to their Facebook friends. So we all have an obligation to learn how to do this better. In addition, did you realize that true stories actually take longer to spread than false stories? And they've done studies on this. I find it fascinating. So top false news on Twitter spreads to 100,000 people on average, while true stories or truth on Twitter rarely was dispersed to more than 1,000 people. That is just staggering to me, and that's a research out of MIT. In addition, did you know or did you hear the news about Macedonia as the fake news capital of the world? It was discovered that before the 2016 election, teenagers in Macedonia were controlling more than 100 websites intentionally designed to mislead about the US political election, the US election. So teenagers at that time could make more money by creating and promoting these fake news websites than what they could make in the normal workforce in their region. So the reality is that fake news spreads faster, wider, and more robustly than truthful news. And that's where we all have a role to play. But what I want to do then is I want to recruit for more fact checkers. I want to ask if you might consider stepping up your ability to help us check facts before you share information. And in order to do that and to show you how easy it is to join in the effort of being a fact checker, I just want to play a 3-minute video because it really sums up and makes it clear how easy it is for all of us to make a difference when it comes to reducing the amount of false information that is spread. So I'm going to come back into my stop sharing and then go around and jump over to my video. This is just 3 minutes, so I think you'll find it's worth your time. I hope that the audio is okay. How to spot fake news.
Fake news is nothing new, but bogus stories can reach more people more quickly via social media than what good old-fashioned viral emails could accomplish in years past. A lot of these viral claims aren't news at all, but fiction, satire, and efforts to fool readers into thinking they're for real. Here are some strategies to shield yourself from fake news. Are you familiar with the source? Is it legitimate? Has it been reliable in the past? If not, you may not want to trust it. If a provocative headline drew your attention, read a little further before you decide to pass along the shocking information. Even in legitimate news stories, the headline doesn't always tell the whole story. But fake news, particularly efforts to be satirical, can include several revealing signs in the text. One fake story even attributed a quote to a dolphin. If that had been real, you could argue they buried the lead. Another telltale sign of a fake story is often the byline, if there even is one. And in some cases, the authors are not even real. One story was credited to a doctor who won 14 Peabody Awards and a handful of Pulitzer Prizes, which would be very impressive if it wasn't also totally made up. Many times these bogus stories will cite official or official-sounding sources, but once you look into it, the source doesn't back up the claim. Some false stories aren't completely fake, but rather distortions of real events. These mendacious claims can take a legitimate news story and twist what it says, or even claim that something that happened long ago is related to current events. One deceptive website took a story that was over a year old from CNN and slapped on a new, misleading headline and publication date. So on top of the deception, there was copyright infringement. Remember, there is such a thing as satire. Normally it's clearly labeled as such, and sometimes it's even funny. But it isn't the news. And then there's the more debatable forms of satire, designed to pull one over on the reader. These posts are also designed to encourage clicks and generate money for the creator through ad revenue. But they aren't news. We know this is difficult. Confirmation bias leads people to put more stock in information that confirms their beliefs and discount information that doesn't. But the next time you're automatically appalled at some social media post concerning, say, a politician you oppose, take a moment to check it out. Try this simple test. What other stories have been posted to the news website that is the source of the story that just popped up in your social media feed? You may be predisposed to believe a story about a politician you don't like, but if the alleged news site also features a story about Guardians from Antarctica retaliating against America by hitting New Zealand with an earthquake, maybe you should think twice before sharing. And yes, that earthquake story is a real example of a fake story that popped up. We know you're busy, and some of this debunking takes time, but fact checkers get paid to do this kind of work. Between factcheck.org, Snopes.com, the Washington Post Fact Checker, and PolitiFact.com, it's likely at least one has already fact-checked the latest viral claim to pop up in your social media newsfeed. And remember, Newsreaders themselves remain the first line of defense against fake news. To see more, go to factcheck.org.
How you can enjoy high-quality sleep and a cleaner ocean with the new Beauty Rest Harmony Luxe.
All right, so that's why I am hoping that you'll join me as a fact checker and applying some of what the video talked about to the news that you share. And also maybe consider subscribing to a credible news source and limiting the options that you go to for your news sources. Finally, I just want to thank the Ames Public Library for their leadership in this area and for all of you for being here, because I think the best thing that we can do is continue to develop our digital media literacy by taking part in workshops just like this. Thank you. I believe we have time for a question or two. I'm going to stop sharing and come back into the group and turn my video back on.
Shall we just ask people to unmute themselves? We don't really have anything in chat. If anyone has a question now, I would say if it develops later, there will be more time for conversation at the end. So.
Sure. Thank you. I think I will assume that if you have questions that come up, please feel free to share those at any time, and we will, at the end of our workshop today, make sure we get those answered. Now, though, I'd like to return to my screen and introduce you to our next presenter. So it's my great honor and privilege to introduce Sherry Bergefer, who is a colleague and a friend of mine. Sherry is an associate teaching professor in the Greenlee School of Journalism and Communication at Iowa State University. Her areas of expertise are visual communication and human-computer interaction. She has more than 20 years of experience as a practitioner and an educator. As a former reporter, she understands the importance of being able to trust news sources. As a visual communicator, she understands how critical truthfulness is in visual messages. So with that, Sherry, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Julie. I am going to share my screen here. Let me pull this up, and there we go. I'm really glad to have been invited to participate in this. I take a little different look at things with my background being in visuals. It's really important to talk about the visual components as well. And when I say visuals, I'm talking about the pictures, I'm talking about videos, even some of the infographics that are out there, the charts and graphs. We need to be really critical whenever we look at these kinds of things. So as soon as I get this to switch, whether we realize it or not, we consume vast amounts of visuals on a daily basis. If we look at just the realm of social media, Snapchat and Facebook users watch about 8 billion videos daily, while Twitter users watch about 2 million. Every 20 minutes, 1 million links are shared on Facebook, and approximately 6,000 tweets are sent every second. Let those numbers sink in for just a second. That's a lot of information out there that's being shared. Now, all of the images that I have down along the bottom here, these are all images that accompanied stories that have trended on Twitter within the last 48 hours. So we've got a wide variety of information that's out there. So why are images so important? Well, images are actually felt more than text is. And when I teach this, I always talk about, this is the sciencey section. I promise it's not painful, but the eye-brain connection that we have is actually really, really complex. In fact, over 50% of the surface of the brain is devoted to just processing visuals. So a really simplified version of how this works is the visual signals that we take in through our eye are broken down into electrical signals. They travel the optic nerve from the eyes to the back of the brain where our visual processing center is. Along the way, those electrical signals are then parsed and broken into color and shape and motion and all of these different pieces. Once they hit the back of the brain, they start to get processed together again, starting to get reassembled, and then they're sent out to different parts of the brain. The parietal lobe, for instance, is responsible for our sensory perception. The temporal lobe helps us with emotion and memory, and all of these, parietal, temporal, and occipital, they're all tied into visual processing. Researchers at MIT have discovered that we can actually process images in as little as 13 milliseconds. So basically with that last image I put up, by the time you saw that and registered that it was and consciously registered it, that, you know, it was a human brain, by that point, your brain had already done all of the processing. It was telling you what it was storing some of that information away. That's how fast processing is. Now, because images are processed so quickly, we aren't very good at being able to guard our judgment. You know, so much of this happens at the subconscious level that by the time we realize that we're having some kind of emotional response to what we're seeing, whether that's where we're pleased with what we see, we're saddened by it, we're angered by it, everything has already been processed and stored away in memory. Now, it's not uncommon for us to see Photoshopped images online. We see them all the time. And we like to think that we're pretty good at being able to spot them. For instance, on the left here, we have a version of a photo that went viral. And the text accompanying it talked about this pilot who opened the cockpit window while he was in flight to use a selfie stick to take his own picture. Okay. There are a lot of things that we could look at with the image that would tell us that this isn't actually the case. Yes, he did take the picture, but he was actually still on the ground when he did this. And we have pictures like this, where we have a bear chasing a bicyclist down the road. Okay, looking at this one, we can see that in the left version of the image, you know, the shadow isn't quite right under the bicycle, the lighting isn't quite right, maybe this isn't a real image. It doesn't take much searching to find that the bear running down the road was the real element in this composite image. Okay, but what about images like this one? This is a photo that made the rounds, and it said that this was a Syrian boy who was sleeping between the graves of his parents. Okay. Is this a fake image? Well, kind of. The picture itself is real. The story behind it is not. Yes, this was a little boy laying between two graves. They were not the graves of his parents. This little boy actually knew the photographer and he was deliberately posing for the picture. And this is where we start to run into some real issues. This is something that's called false captions. And we see this happen all the time in social media. The problem is that when we talk about images, the text and the visuals really work synergistically. They become really intertwined in telling a story. And knowing how quickly we process images, by the time we have the story with the words and the text, it becomes really hard to break those apart later on down the road. So what this means is we should probably start to be really skeptical of the images that we're seeing out there. Does this mean that we should only accept them from trustworthy sources? Well, in some cases, especially with social media, that's going to depend on what you consider to be a trustworthy source. This is an image that appeared on one of my Facebook friends' timelines. Do I consider my Facebook friends to be trustworthy sources? If they're posting their own photos, most of the time, if they're sharing things, not a chance. This picture, and I know it's hard to read the text on there. The red text on the left says, America, do you know this cop? Email in confidence. And then there's an email address on the side. It had the caption, this picture has to go around the world, keep sharing. And what we see is a police officer's hand reaching down, pepper spraying a little girl. And I was reading the comments that people were leaving on my friend's share with this. And I finally had to chime in and say, okay, this picture itself is real. This picture happened. But this picture is from a protest in Brazil in 2011. This was put on her timeline. It was shared just about a month and a half ago, not even that long ago, but this summer in response to the protests that have been going on across the country. The police officers involved in this particular image have already been investigated and charged for their conduct. They've already served their punishments. Or what about something like this, where we see Walter Cronkite posting a picture on Twitter. It's got his tagline, and that's the way it is, saying that thousands of Seattle Democrats are gathering to demand mail-in voting because it's too dangerous to vote in person. This is just from August 16th. The picture itself is from Seattle, but it was taken in June of this year. And it's not people demanding mail-in voting. This is people who are part of the Black Lives Matter protest. But how did Walter get it wrong? Well, this isn't even really Walter. Walter Cronkite died in 2009. Okay. But that did not stop anybody from retweeting. I mean, if we look at the original down here, it was retweeted almost 37,000 times. Okay. But it still got sent out, got retweeted by people, spreading even further. Okay, but those are, those are pictures on Twitter and things like that. What about the memes that are out there? I mean, I didn't put together a poll, but I would hazard a guess that a lot of us have probably shared at least one meme. And memes actually serve a purpose. They're not just there to make us laugh. They have a role as a social statement. They are very culturally influenced. While it's obvious in this case that Lincoln, of course, did not make this particular quote, or say this quote that we see in the meme on the left, because let's face it, there was no internet at that time. Memes get a little fuzzy, especially when you look at something like this quote that's being attributed to Socrates. Okay, so just because we have these pictures and these words together doesn't necessarily mean that they're real. In fact, this has a term for it, and it's called the truthiness effect. Okay, what this says is that research has actually shown adding a picture to a statement or to a quote, whether the quote is real or not, makes people more likely to actually believe that statement, even if the picture is completely unrelated to the idea. Okay. Now, memes, they extend outside the internet as well. Poor Abe, he gets picked on a lot when it comes to memes. There are so many things that people are saying he said that he never did, including this very loose paraphrase on the left. America will never be destroyed from the outside. If we lose our freedoms, it will be because we have destroyed ourselves from within. Okay. As I said, this is a very loose paraphrasing of part of his Lyceum address of 1838, in which he actually said, if destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. This quote that you see on the screen was actually debunked by Snopes in 2019. So it's been known for over a year that this was not true. This is not something he actually said. But this did not stop Laura Trump from using it as part of her speech at the Republican National Convention on August 26th. Let's see if I can.
Abraham Lincoln once famously said, "America will never be destroyed from the outside. If we falter and lose our freedoms, it will be because we destroyed ourselves." While those words were spoken over 150 years ago, never have they been more relevant.
Except they weren't actually spoken even 150 years ago. Well, that brings up this whole idea of videos. Okay, videos themselves tend to present challenges. We know this. Clips can be taken out of context and they can be edited to leave out relevant portions. But surely we can believe that videos themselves actually happened, right? Oh, that's not exactly true. Because we're now entering the realm of deepfakes. And so in addition to everything else that we have out there right now, now we have these videos that are being put out that are not real at all. The term deepfake is it's a mishmash of the words deep learning and fake. And this is a form of machine learning in which artificial intelligence learns the different angles of a source space in order to transpose it onto another. If anybody uses Snapchat and you've used the face swap in there with, you know, your significant other, your friends, your children, your pets, technically that is a form of a deep fake. Okay? Deep fakes are not hard to do. In fact, last weekend, I downloaded an app on my phone, used it to take a selfie. Within just a few minutes, I became Hermione Granger from Harry Potter. A couple of minutes later, I was Professor McGonagall. Okay. And when we look at the originals on each of these, you can see how my facial features became blended with theirs to create a person who doesn't actually exist. Deepfakes are really easy to create. Like I said, I downloaded an app and within 15 minutes, I had several photos and videos and GIFs that had part of me in them downloaded onto my phone. A lot of the apps that are out there are free, computer apps and phone apps. There are some that you pay for, and you can get some really sophisticated ones. But it's important to remember that these are completely synthesized images. These are not real images. And it's, when we think about them in terms of Snapchat, well, what's the harm? You know, we're doing this for fun. Maybe I'm making a profile picture out of it. No big deal, right? Well, it becomes a big deal when things start getting put out for broader consumption. And I'm going to play just a little bit at the start of this video, and then I'm going to jump to the end to show you what actually happened.
How do you think history will remember John?
Sometimes I'll put my hands out like this. Sometimes I give you two palms. Sometimes John Lewis, look, he didn't come to my inauguration, so I'm not a fan. The Dalai Lama didn't come either. Neither did Mother Teresa. She's very mean, very nasty to me. She was.
That is most prominent.
Yeah, let's jump ahead a little
John
bit
Lewis,
here.
look, he didn't come to my inauguration, so I'm not a fan. The Dalai Lama didn't come either. Neither did Mother Teresa. She's very mean, very nasty to me. She was.
Okay, for the sake of time, we didn't watch that entire clip. It is out there. If you can Google Jimmy Fallon as Donald Trump. Now, of course, that was a much better deepfake than the one that I downloaded on my app. And you can see that it was actually Jimmy doing the talking, and then there was Trump's face was mapped to his, so that you got this perfect lip sync. That means that we can have people saying things that they never said. Okay. Now, in addition to deep fakes, we have something that is almost as concerning. Actually, it is just as concerning, and these are called cheap fakes. Now, with these are real videos, but they tend to be pieced together from other videos, or there's been some kind of editing involved. Now we have one here from August 3rd, and this one is actually called Drunk Pelosi. What happened in this, it's taken from C-SPAN video, and the portions where she is speaking have actually been slowed down to make her appear as if she's slurring her words and as if she might be drunk.
I'm sorry, to do what? I'm sorry, I don't understand. What did he do?
That's Psycho, we call him Psycho Joe.
Oh, you're talking about Joe Scarborough?
Yeah.
You're asking me about the appropriateness of the actions of the...
Try and get that to stop.
I'm sorry, to do...
There we go. So yeah, it's just part of it was slowed down. The part where she's being asked questions is being played at actual speed. And so it creates this new narrative. It looks like I am at time, so I am just going to jump past this next one. If you're interested in seeing another one that is really recent on August 30th, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Communications, Dan Scavino, actually posted one of Joe Biden supposedly falling asleep on air. He posted that to his Twitter. Scavino has almost 1 million followers. And even though the creator actually said how he did this, it still was put out the very next day by Scavino. We do have some tools that we can use for this. There are reverse image searches that we can use. We can also go to places like Fact Check and Snopes. Snopes actually has a photography archive, and that's faux, F-A-U-X, where we can actually check and verify whether some of these images that we're seeing in social media is real. All right, with that, I will open it up to any questions. Yeah, there's so much out there. When you start looking at it, it gets really interesting, and it really makes you question kind of everything that you see. All right. So I would like to now introduce our next speakers. Next up, we will be hearing from graduate students Anthony Miller and Rachel O'Donnell. Anthony Miller is in the, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get the window up here that I need, I apologize. Both Anthony and Rachel are in the psychology department, in cognitive psychology, dealing with, I know Rachel deals with misidentification in witness statements. So I will go ahead and pass that along.
All right, I'm going to be presenting on some basic heuristics from psychology that can help you understand why fake news is so appealing, how it's so easy to recall and remember, and why you kind of seek out information that reinforces your pre-existing beliefs. But first, let's cover some reasons why misinformation exists in the first place. The first being clickbait. The basis for ad revenue is generated by the number of clicks a given site has, not by how many facts are within a journal. So there's no real revenue incentive to have truthful, factful articles. There's also intentional propaganda. So people intentionally making biased or misleading information to promote or publicize a given cause. And this is largely driven by outrage and anger. Anger is the second most viral emotion. We see that it gets online very quickly and spreads much quicker than things that make you happy or sad. The most viral emotion is awe, which doesn't typically get included in things that are political or that drive a lot of action. And then there's unintentional falsehood. So a writer could just not have a great understanding of the topic that they're writing about, and they're generating things very quickly and don't have time to fact check for themselves. They can also turn any real news event into something that they know that the audience wants to hear. They also have the choice about what they're covering in the first place. So even if they're not being mendacious, they could just be covering events that keep confirming a bias that they already have. And then there's the reliance on heuristics, which is going to be the bulk of what I'm talking about. Heuristics are mental shortcuts. They're simple, efficient rules of thumb that we use to form judgments and make decisions. You use them all the time, and they typically don't have much of a negative consequence. It's just, cognitively speaking, we're lazy. We don't like to think much more about something than we have to. And in most cases in our life, that works out just fine. But in a complex information environment, you can run into a lot of errors. So these heuristics are unconscious. We don't know that we're doing them. They're very fast, and they're often emotionally based. And though they're typically helpful, they can lead to bias, including errors of judgment and decision-making. All right, so the first one I'm going to cover is the availability heuristic. And the basic conceit of this is that the quicker or easier it is to think about a certain event happening, the more likely you are to think that it is happening. Sorry, I have some messages. I should check those before I keep talking.
Hey.
Yeah, what's up?
It's good. That's good.
Okay. So negative, extreme, and emotional events come to your mind easier, and so we think they're more common than they actually are. The basis of this heuristic is that the easier it is for you to remember something, to think about an example, the more likely you think that this happens in the real world. You have more instances of it in your mind, and so you think there must be more instances of this out in the world itself. The go-to example is the rates of deaths by vehicle transportation. You can think of lots of examples of airplane crashes, and you might get scared about going on an airplane. Airplane crashes are dramatic, extreme emotional events that get lots of news coverage, and they have names, right? So you have this available memory about airplane crashes, but you don't have a lot of available memories of motorcycle crashes, which are much more deadly. In reality, there is very little relationship between how easy it is to think about a particular event occurring and how likely that event is to occur. And oftentimes they're inversely related because something that is unusual or extreme is easier to think about. For example, what proportion of American men do you think are 6'4" or taller? And we have some choices like 25 to 0.5%. Now I posited this to one of my classes, and the average came to about 20% of my students thought that American men are 6'4" or taller. But the actuality, it's 0.5%, about 1 in 200 American men. However, everybody can think about a couple of examples in their own life, so they don't think that it can be that extreme of an event. Another one, how many stranger danger abductions occur yearly in the US? And just to help out with guesses, there's about 80 million kids in the United States. All right, so you could guess a number between 50,000 and 300. And a lot of people have like stories in their head about stranger danger abductions that they can name and recall. And they tend to be extreme events with narratives to them, but they're very, very uncommon. We have 80 million children and about 300 stranger danger abductions a year. Which is a percentile of about 0.00003% chance of a child getting abducted in a given year. And these are just some data I got from my students. I had them try to estimate what proportion of the population was left-handed or allergic to peanuts. And then I showed them the true value and what the mean difference is in what their estimates were and what the true value is. And you can see that for a lot of very extreme things like extremely rare things, people had massive overestimations about what proportion of the population had this quality. And this is because most people know at least one person that's redheaded, or they know at least one person that's allergic to peanuts. And so you have a hard time imagining that less than 2% of the population has this given trait. Now, fake news capitalizes on the availability heuristic. They know that negative, unusual, and emotionally charged headlines will cement that information in your memory and make it easier to recall later. Right? So you can have a series of these extreme images that seem unusual, and so you think, oh, this happens at least once. I've seen an image of it. This must be something that happens more than that. However, all of these things are fake. And the next bias I'm going to go over very quickly is the confirmation bias, which most people are probably familiar with. You tend to look for information that's already consistent with the opinions that you have, and you ignore information or actively avoid it that contradicts your pre-existing beliefs. You search for, interpret, and are much more likely to recall any information that reaffirms attitudes that you already hold. So we find it easy to find information that agrees with our beliefs. If we're scanning through headlines, the ones that trigger a positive response because it's confirming something that you believe, you're going to focus on that information. And if it disagrees with you, you'll avoid it because it's unpleasant to think about it. And consciously doing the opposite, consciously looking for information that is counterfactual to your beliefs, is very difficult and very uncomfortable. And here's an example of how this might work in action. So say this person thinks that dogs are better than cats. Right? This is a dog person. So if they're scanning quickly through images online, they might come across these two images and they'll be like, yeah, cats do suck. They are mean. And dogs are super cute. And so they'll focus on these, they'll remember them more, and if scanning through a large amount of them, if they come across these images where you see a particularly cute kitten and a threatening dog, they might skip over them. They won't remember them. They won't talk about them later. Confirmation bias also applies to interpreting ambiguous events. So things where there might be more than one explanation. So if you have an event where I say this person sees a cat and a dog interacting, and it's not clear which of these animals is chasing the other, somebody that's already a dog person, who's already inclined to believe that dogs are better than cats, would say like, no, this cat's being aggressive and messing with the dog, and the dog is responding. And might focus on information in the image that solidifies this belief and provides evidence for it. So that's the end of my section, and I'm going to pass it off to Rachel now.
All right, is my screen sharing?
Yes.
Yes.
So I'm just going to very briefly cover source monitoring, which is basically the idea that when you see a piece of information or a news article, you should ask yourself where that information comes from. I'm sure that a lot of you have heard something before, or you've seen something in the news and you feel that the information is familiar to you, and you also feel that it's right, but you can't remember where the information came from. This sort of thing is very common and normal. It's because of the nature of source monitoring is that it's easier to remember the actual information we hear rather than where that information is coming from. So it's important to think about sources when you're reading news articles, that you can try and understand why that particular source is trying to communicate that information with you. So source monitoring is easier when your memory is more vivid. If there are more details in the memory, it's easier to remember where it's coming from. And likewise, if there are less details in the memory, it's a lot more difficult to remember where it came from. So when you see a news article or a headline or just a blurb on Facebook or your social media feed, like for example, say someone is telling you it's possible to power your entire house with solar energy. You could just scroll past it and keep going and take it in, or you could think about where the source is coming from. If it's a celebrity with no background scientific knowledge, should you believe that person? Probably not. But if it's a scientist who has background information about solar energy, it is more likely that the information they are telling you is true. So it's important to think about whether or not the source has the knowledge to be sharing this information with you, whether or not they have the credibility to back up whatever the information it is that they're sharing. So how does this apply to misinformation and fake news? A lot of the times when you're scrolling through your feed on Facebook, you're not actively monitoring, you're just reading things. The misinformation can look credible and it can appear believable. It's easy to just scroll past it and think to yourself, well, that sounds familiar, so it must be true, and move on with your life. And in addition to this, even when we recognize that information is false, so say you're scrolling through Facebook and you see a headline and you know that it's not true, later on, after, let's say, several days or even a few weeks, if you forget the source of that information and you see it again later on, you think, well, I know I've heard that before, but I can't remember where it came from. It can lead you to believe the misinformation is true. This is something that's called the sleeper effect. So as an example, let's say that you are talking to your friend or you're reading a news article and it says putting Vicks on your feet with socks on before you go to bed will help you cure the common cold or illness. And you think to yourself, well, there's no scientific evidence to back that up. You have no proof. There's no data. That's obviously not true. And you go about your day, and then several days or several weeks pass, and later on, someone says again that putting Vicks on your feet with socks will cure illnesses. And you think to yourself, I've heard this before. This sounds familiar. And it sounds true because I know I've heard it before. So because you can no longer remember that the source you heard it from had no credibility and no evidence to back it up, and because it feels familiar to you, now you think it's true. Even though you originally knew it wasn't true, the forgetting of the source later on leads to you believing it's true. So generally speaking, how this happens is that you hear a message or a piece of information, and that message is connected to the source. And you think, wow, this is really interesting, it's believable, it's a catchy headline. Then you investigate the source and you think, there's no evidence, it's kind of a shady website, and you dismiss it. But then time passes and the source becomes disconnected from the information. You can no longer remember that it was a shady website, but you can remember the information itself and you still think that it's interesting and believable information. So this is why it's important to always monitor source and always think about, even if a piece of information is familiar, it's important to think about where the source is, what the source is, and where they're coming from, and why they might want to be sharing that information with you.
All right, so my name is Crystal Jewell. I'm one of the graduate students in psychology. I'm a third-year PhD track student in both neuroscience and cognitive psychology at Iowa State University. And I study mindfulness and creativity, as well as their neural and cognitive underpinning. So what goes on in the brain that links the two together. So today I'm going to be talking about using mindfulness while consuming the media. So first I want to go over what is mindfulness. The definition of mindfulness is paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. So the best way that we can understand this is by example. So let's say that we're going for a walk and we want to try being mindful while we're on this walk. So as we're walking, we're listening to the birds sing. We're feeling the sun shine on our skin and we welcome it. We almost run into a runner who almost goes into us and we jump out of the way and they don't even apologize. And We're being mindful though, so we continue walking and we just let it go. So this is mindfulness. And I also want to mention why mindfulness is important. What does it do for us? So there's actually brain data that shows changes that occur in our brain when we practice mindfulness. We call it functional connectivity. And basically what that means is the more you practice mindfulness, the more connected your brain is, the better you have control over your brain. And what this relates to is better attention, better focus, better memory, better self-regulation. There's a whole host of benefits that arise from practicing mindfulness. As one prominent researcher in the field says, what you practice grows stronger. And this couldn't be more true when we're looking at the brain. So now that we have an idea of what mindfulness is, I want to share 4 steps towards mindful media consumption, which include setting intentions, acting with awareness, practicing non-judgment, and acceptance. So first, setting intentions. More importantly, setting kind intentions. This includes the why. Why are we consuming the media? Why are we scrolling through Facebook? Why are we watching the news? Why are we reading the news? Maybe it's to pay attention to how we respond emotionally, with the intention of remaining calm as we consume the news. Or maybe it's not just to look at the black and white images that the media portrays sometimes, but to see the different shades of gray, because we are all different and we all have different beliefs and different intentions as well. Or maybe it's to balance out the media with other things that bring joy into our lives, such as socializing with a loved one, playing music, creating something, or gardening. As John Kabat-Zinn says, your intentions set the stage for what is possible. So secondly, we're going to be acting with awareness, and this is basically just putting our intentions to work. So if we're trying to look at all angles of the media, then maybe we're compassionately putting ourselves into the other person's shoes to see from their angle. Or if we're paying attention to our emotions, then we're aware that it's okay to feel them, but are we acting out with them? Or if we're trying to balance out the media with other things that bring us joy, then maybe we're aware of the time that we spend consuming the media, or we're setting a time limit for ourselves. As Fritz Perls says, attention in and of itself is curative. Now third, we're practicing non-judgment. And the way that we can do this is through our language, through the words that we speak. And not only can we practice non-judgment ourselves, we can also use it as a tool to figure out if the news that we're reading is an opinion or if it's a fact. And I want to quickly go over an example with you guys to show you what I mean by this. So this information is pulled from this website down here, adfontsmedia.com. It was mentioned earlier by Julie when she displayed that graph of media bias. So here's the first article. Trumpers scared of Mad Daddy when he finds out what they told Robert Mueller. Ooh, scandalous. And just to be bipartisan, Bernie's supporters can't define socialism. These are the uneducated Americans who will vote for Sanders. And third, after Boeing crashes, more people want help taming fear of flying. So if we're thinking about non-judgment in terms of the media, then we're looking for stigmatizing language, we're looking for stereotyping language, anything that divides or is name calling. And in these first two, we have Mad Daddy and uneducated Americans. So This is an issue with stereotyping language, which unfairly puts people into different groups based on assumptions. We also have Trumpers and Bernie supporters, which also encourages stigmatizing. As I mentioned earlier, we are all different. We all have different brains. So we cannot always judge an individual by the group. In this third article, we see non-judgment being practiced as they refer just to people. So the verdict by agfontsmedia.com was indeed that these first two articles are extremely biased and extremely unreliable, or in other words, they're extremely unfair and extremely untrustworthy. And this last article is unbiased completely and extremely trustworthy. So our fourth step and final step in mindful media consumption is acceptance. And that is acceptance for that which you cannot change and acceptance for that which you cannot control, such as the news, the hearts and minds of others, and the state of the world. And although we cannot control or change the state of the world, what we can change and control is what we have to offer to it, such as connection, compassion, and empathy towards others, which I think is what this world really needs right now. That's all I have for you guys. If you want to email me, here it is right here in the left-hand corner, cjewel@iustate.edu. I'd love to hear from you guys if you have any questions that you didn't think of during this webinar that you want to follow up with, feel free to email me.
All right, I don't believe there were questions for Crystal. If you do have questions though, as we move through this next section of our workshop, be sure to save those and I'm sure she'd be happy to answer those. So I want to thank Sherry, Anthony, Rachel, and Crystal for all of the valuable information that they've shared with us today. They've given us much to think about, I think we can all agree, and much to practice, especially if we're in a bit of a funk now based on the outcome of the Iowa State game. So with that being said, I just want to share with you a reminder about the tools and strategies that you have hopefully taken away from today's mini lectures. First of all, think like a fact checker. Secondly, don't always believe what you see and use the tools that are available to help you evaluate visuals. Third, be aware of the psychology behind our actions. And then finally, last but not least, absolutely not least, practice media mindfulness.
Okay, so now we're going to take a moment to apply some of the tips and tricks covered in the lecture component of the workshop. We're going to look at 4 case studies today. The first one, we're going to look at a couple of sites and figure out if we can spot which one is fake news. Next, we'll look at a couple of news sites and also kind of see which one is legitimate and which one is fake. Then we'll take a look at an individual who is known for creating fake news and the reasons behind why that was attractive to him and to other people who do this. And then we'll look at how fake news spreads in real time by looking at an example of an instance in which that occurred. Okay. So for our first case study, we're going to take a look at a couple of news stories and see if we can figure out which ones are fake and which ones are legitimate. So take a couple moments to look at this first example. Take a look at the headline. You can read a little bit of the blurb below. And just take a moment to think about whether or not you think this is real or if it's fake. Turns out this one is actually true. Let's try another one. So take a look at this and we'll do the same thing. Is this news story real or is it fake? This one is actually fake. Okay, let's take a look at a couple more. What do you think? Real or fake? Definitely fake. And our last one. And this story is true. So, did you get all of them right? Well, don't worry if you did or if you didn't. What we want you to take away from this is that you can't always rely on headlines alone to help you detect fake news. Some of those headlines were stranger than fiction, but in some cases, they are true. So you want to make sure that you dig a little deeper before you determine it by just looking at the headline. All right, we'll move on to the next case study, and we'll look at a couple of tips and tricks for helping us detect fake news. So now we're going to look at an ABC News site, and we're just going to determine which one we think is real. So I'm going to pull them up here, and just take a moment to look at them. At first glance, can you tell whether both are real? Is one fake? Are both fake? What do you notice about each site? Okay. Well, the site on the left actually has several issues, starting with the URL. So as you can see, this one ends in .com, .co, whereas the legitimate one ends in just .com. But in addition to that, the one on the left lacks bylines, and bylines are bits that tell you the author of the articles. So you don't really see any on the left. You see by admin on that one. There's also a lot of mechanical errors such as punctuation, grammar, and spelling in the first example on the left. And then if we were to navigate to these websites, you would see the one on the left lacks an about link at the bottom of the site, which you can click on to tell you more about the website. If that's missing, that's kind of a red flag. Okay, So again, we're just reiterating the tips and tricks that we learned from the previous example. So you want to pay attention to the URL at websites that you're looking at. You want to check for an about link somewhere on the page. It's often at the bottom. You want to make sure that, again, there aren't a lot of errors with grammar, spelling, punctuation. Typically, legitimate news sites are going to have editors that make sure that the mechanical things in there are going to be accurate. And then also, who is producing this news story? If you don't see, you can't identify who has written it, that's another reason to be skeptical. Some common points of confusion are that fake sites often look real, and as you saw in the previous example, they're even modeled after a real site. If there are links involved in the actual body of the story, you might want to try clicking on those and navigating them to see if they actually go to legitimate websites. Is another way to kind of verify if this website, the story is legitimate. Okay. All right, we're going to move to our next case study, and we're looking at the rise and the fall of the king of fake news. So, do any of you remember this news story back that broke around the 2016 election about an FBI agent suspected in the Hillary email leaks found dead in an apparent murder-suicide? Okay. So is this story real or fake? The Denver Guardian has the ring of a legitimate news source, but let's look a little bit more closely at the actual story. So this story was posted on the 5th of November, a few days before Election Day on the 8th in 2016. The headline was FBI agent suspected in Hillary email leaks found dead in an apparent murder-suicide. It's the only story that was on that website, the denverguardian.com at that time. It quoted a police chief for a police department that doesn't exist. And the address for Denver Guardian led to a parking lot. However, this story was shared on Facebook over 500,000 times and earned over 15 million impressions on social media. So now we're going to take a look at an individual dubbed the king of fake news, Justin Kohler. This individual is remarkably open about his role in creating and distributing fake news. It started as a hobby. He was interested in kind of tracking how fake news spread, but soon discovered that after some of his material was picked up, that he could monetize it, and it became very lucrative. So it is possible for people to make a lot of money by creating fake news and disseminating fake news. So there is a financial incentive for it as well. So again, just to reiterate, we looked at an individual who has created fake news, profited from creating fake news. We looked at the Denver Guardian, which is a now defunct fake news website. And in fact, the link to find it is actually archived because it's illegitimate, it's since been taken down. Understand that there is a financial incentive for people to create and disseminate fake news because of the clicks. So if it's a sensational title or creates high emotions, it is incentivizing people to click on that. Okay, we're going to go to our last one. And this one, we're going to actually look at how fake news can spread over a relatively short period of time. Entire thing, we're just looking at some of the web captures from that article. But we're looking at an individual named Eric Tucker posted this on Twitter on November 9th about anti-Trump protesters in Austin being bussed in. And he provided some photos of buses lined up outside. Okay, as you can see at the bottom, this had over 14,000 likes and 16,000 retweets on that first day. On the second day, this was actually picked up by a couple of other websites. It was picked up by Reddit, it was picked up by freerepublic.com and Fox News. So in being shared with those websites are also generating additional impressions, and people are sharing it from those websites as well. As you can see over here to the right, over 300,000 people shared the link on the Free Republic. So this is still day 2. Okay, I can see that it's continuing to spread. And then on the evening of day 2, the president actually commented on, reacted to this post. So just had a very open and successful presidential election. Now professional protesters incited by the media are protesting. Very unfair. So as you can see, in a very short period of time, it was picked up by different news organizations or different social media websites, and even made it to the president's purview, so that he's thinking that it's legitimate and actually tweeted about it. Okay. On day 3, Eric tweeted a link to his blog admitting that actually he could have been wrong in the original tweet. Snopes actually debunked the original tweet, and Tableau, the tour bus company, or Tableau, excuse me, the organization that was using the buses, issued a statement that they had hired those buses for a conference. Okay. And yet, even though he removed the original tweet and replaced it with an image carrying the label of false, that post a week later had only 29 retweets. And the original tweet by day 3 had nearly 17,000 retweets and over 14,000 likes, which is quite a stark difference. So as we reflect on this, why do you think that this story went viral so quickly? And then why do you think that the admission that it was wrong was so easily disregarded and spread so much more slowly than the original piece of information that was later debunked? Okay, well, that concludes our case study. I hope that this allowed you to kind of, again, apply some of those tips and tricks that we talked about in the earlier discussion, and that you'll be able to use them as you move forward navigating information resources in the future. Thanks.
So this is our time to debrief some of the findings in our breakout rooms, and I'll just have who that was just talking share with us about what your experience was in thinking through these case studies.
Thanks, Julie. That was me here. I'll turn my video on so you can see me here quick. Do you want me to talk about just any of the case studies in particular or all of them?
Why don't you just pick one that particularly stands out?
So I need to look back at my notes here. I think, and any of my breakout group can chime in if I am misrepresenting this. I think the case study that I got the most out of and that I enjoyed presenting on the most was the second case study that actually does talk about some tips and tricks to try to tell what stories might be fake and what websites or news sources might be fake versus not fake. So we talked a lot about the URL piece and how different organizations or fake news people can bypass the URL idea. So instead of having it be abcnews.com, it's abcnews.com.co, or how organizations will add extra periods in or other punctuation marks to a normal website's URL to try to look like as much like the real URL as possible, and that sort of thing. And talking about the how important it is to make sure that real authors are listed as the authors or writers for news articles and that sort of thing. Trying to think what else to share. My brain's moving a little fast. Anthony, did you have anything else since you were also in there with us?
And we can bring it back around group 6. We will maybe get some feedback from breakout room 2, where I had the privilege of participating, and see kind of what stood out in that experience for breakout room 2.
That sounds good to me.
Thank you, Tyler.
Corinne, you can also jump in, but I think we had some great discussion and some great advice from the people in our group, from their own experiences, including how to look for fake news by checking out the URLs and looking for bylines, and making sure that there's that the articles that we're looking at don't have grammatical or spelling errors, just as some rules of thumb for how you can look into whether things are fake or real.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. One more thing I think was kind of cool to talk about too in our discussion is some participants talked about sharing of sources they've done in the past, and how maybe they've had friends notice that maybe that was a fake news story, but then in the future implementing different kind of like guidelines for when they share something. So somebody talked about if they have a strong emotional reaction to a news story, they will wait 24 hours and then kind of do some more digging on it to see if it's a factual source, which I just thought was pretty awesome.
Yeah, I saw Audrey's hand pop up there, so she was in my room in group 2. Let's hear from you, Audrey.
I just wanted to add one other tip that I've picked up with social media, and I've learned to read the comments as part of my figuring out. I have been guilty of posting some things, and then I read the article but didn't read the comments, and then somebody pointed it out, it was wrong, and I went back and, oh yeah, 3 comments down, somebody had already said it was a fake news article, the picture was false, so on and so forth. So reading the comments is also for me, something to check into.
Good tip.
Actually, that reminds me of one of the things that one of my group members had, was getting multiple perspectives on the same story. That's a really good tip, and especially if you're worried about political bias on a particular news story, trying to find organizations or news organizations that are presenting it from different perspectives on the political spectrum can help to make sure you're getting both angles, and so that you know that the truth of the story is most likely somewhere in the middle of those perspectives. So I thought that was a great addition to some of the tips that we talked about in our lectures here.
Thank you. Yes, good. And I just want to pick up on what Audrey said too and say sometimes it's kind of painful to read the comments anymore, but there is value in doing that. So that's a good point. And Tyler, yours as well about trying to find where the middle ground is in some of these stories. How about group 3? Let's hear from you with the case studies. Anything maybe we haven't talked about yet that comes to mind?
Hi, I think I'm group 3. I think we've covered a lot of it. I did discuss, am I group 3? I guess I should check on that.
You are.
Okay. Yeah, I think a lot of it's been discussed by Tyler and Ryan and everybody so far. I did share at the end, we had a little bit of bonus time, a couple of bonus case studies, but I don't know.
Okay. Anyone else who was in group 3 want to chime in and maybe talk about something we haven't touched on just yet?
I think one thing we talked about in group 3 was also about how sometimes the correction articles or retractions, they don't become as widely spread as the original false article. And so we talked about reasons why that might be, you know, people not wanting to admit that they posted something that was incorrect, or, you know, again, the retractions or these correction articles tend to go against their kind of initial confirmation biases or things like that. So.
Okay, good. Yeah, that came up in our group as well. Ryan, do you want to pick up on that just a little bit?
Sure, I'm happy to. So we basically talked a little bit about what Anthony covered in his presentation with confirmation bias, and how a lot of the time when we're looking at these stories, the reason that we fall for them is often because we already agree, or we want to agree with what they're telling us, and so we don't want to be skeptical. It can be hard. It can be really hard to be skeptical when it's something you want to believe is true. And then the reverse, the thing that that Anthony didn't have a chance to talk about, but is also important, is this idea that when we find out that information that we agree with is wrong, it can be really hard to let go of that. We try to justify our choices and our decisions, even when we later find out that maybe we shouldn't have agreed with those things or made those decisions. That's just part of human nature.
Good, thank you. That also came up when we were looking at the last case study, and we were sharing that we were disappointed in how quickly that tweet of the photo of the buses spread, but then the reverse of that, when he acknowledged it wasn't an accurate portrayal, that didn't spread. So I think that kind of fits exactly in there. Thank you. All right, group 4, and then we'll wrap up with group 5 to get some feedback. So how about group 4, something to share?
Yeah, so we had similar thoughts towards the last case study. We were talking about how it may be easier to believe the false news because, you know, especially when it's like, you know, something that you agree with, and how once you share something, everything is already out there. So it's harder to fix that once it happens. And so it's just harder to listen or to the information that is presented afterwards. And so, as you mentioned, you know, the first tweet garnered so much attention versus the second tweet. And something participant mentioned how we were actually wondering how, I guess, how much attention the bus company may have, you know, received, and how sometimes maybe even, these are just my thoughts right now, but how maybe other companies may, may profit from just these fake news happening. And another thought in terms of the second case study about the Denver Guardian, we talked about how the term Denver Guardian may make people believe that this is a much more credible site than it actually is. Yeah.
Yeah. Very intentional selection of the name of that site. So you're absolutely right. And I also like what you said about how, you know, our attention spans are so small, we're kind of over it. And so we don't, when something is corrected, we've already moved on. So those are really good points. Thank you. Group 5, let's hear from you.
So I was the facilitator for group 5. I think Crystal or Abby can kind of talk more about it, but I kind of found that I feel like we had like almost I would say almost like a sublimeness of like how difficult it is to kind of tell which one was fake or which one was real, you know, from like the tiger, like with the first case study, to what was the other one? We were so unsure. Like, did the emoji child exist? Whereas like we knew like the Elon Musk child existed, but the emoji child didn't exist. So it's kind of like sometimes fact from fiction seems so almost hard to like tell, especially if you can, you know, spice it up well enough. So I feel like, you know, I think we found like those media habits are just so important, and it's so difficult to really pick apart kind of based off of like an image. I think we had like the Florida man one where Florida man threw a crocodile through like a window, and we just like, we couldn't tell. We were like, is this like a fake, you know, is this a fake crocodile? Is this like a fake image? Is it like Photoshopped? Like it could totally be Photoshopped. And it seems so difficult based off of just like looking at a photo or a snapshot of a headline, how impossible it is to tell which one's real and which one's fake.
Absolutely. So developing that healthy sense of skepticism, but also at the same time recognizing that truth can be stranger than fiction. And so it really is hard to tell. So great. That's great feedback. How about the wider group? Would anyone like to share something that's been on your mind about the breakouts?
I just want to share an observation that I made about myself. You know, in the first part of the presentation, there was the mentioning about how quickly we process a visual. And in the breakouts, when the one between the two ABC News websites, and yeah, I automatically picked up on the CBS, whichever it was, logo. And then it was brought up to me that there are websites that will duplicate that logo onto the fake one. And I was like, oh my God, I do it, you know? But that just kind of showed me that I need to look further. Okay, there's the logo, but what about this and what about that?
Good. Thank you for sharing. We didn't talk about in that case study, but if we had more time to actually go to those sites, if you scroll to the bottom and you check the about link, you'll find with these fake sites that a lot of times that's a dead link. It won't go anywhere. So always checking for the about at the bottom is really a good strategy as well to sort of verify whether something is real or not. Thank you. Anybody else?
I mean, if you wouldn't mind me coming in with unsolicited advice based off someone who's I am pretty got politically active around 2016. I would say firstly, like we kind of talked about it. I think I'm just gonna be re-emphasizing points, but I'll put on my video so you can see me stare out the window. Was that for media, like looking across is so important. I think a great example was the CHOP, like the Chaz Hill, I forget what the whole full name was, but I remember reading an article of how like there was like burning and looting in the streets, and it was such an extreme view, and I had to like look at like ABC News, and then I flipped over to like Vox, and I flicked over, and I kind of could tell based off of like how different, even like valid, I would say, news sites were kind of reporting. You could tell that there was like a real conflict of viewpoints, where some were reporting like, oh, people were dying and there was things happening, whereas a lot of them were like, this is kind of just a hippie circle, like nothing's really happening, people are just discussing. So even like, I would say even amongst valid, sometimes it's really just important to look across. If you can't even just skim an article to see like for words, if there's anything kind of different. And I like a lot when it's not like, I know like breaking news, you can't really check sources because they don't have any other than their opinion or like what they're saying. So then it's really based off the news site, how much you trust it. But if there's like links, 99%, the best way to check is if you open up 4 links and they reference themselves, that's a huge no-no. Like if they're linking themselves, that's like kind of untrustworthy. Or if they're linking and it's linking to like an even sketchier website as their source, that's even, that's a big no-no. But if they're, if you can see that they're linking the actual article of something, then usually that's where I would be more trustworthy.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Yeah, actually the abcnews.com.co link, when you put it on the browser, it redirects you to another site. And so that was just, like physically, entering it sends you somewhere else. And that's fishy already.
Yeah.
I kind of said it in the in our group, but if this is kind of from my computer science days, but if you can kind of look on like, I guess if you open up a web browser, you can see on your URL there's like a little lock. That's usually a sign that like that's the actual website. If there's no lock there, I would be untrustworthy. Like they could be phishing your data, they could be doing other stuff, and a lot of like fake news or fake websites in general will pretend to look like a different website so they can collect your data, and they won't have that lock. So extra CS knowledge.
Yeah, really good to know.
Thank you.
Is this a request for all participants or just the
Yes, all participants.
Okay. I was reading, I think it was in Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. He was a big promoter of newspapers and libraries. And he said, probably in his autobiography, that in his time, newspapers were not there to report the news, but to influence public opinion. And that's been 1765 or something like that. So there's nothing new under the sun. We just have a lot of ways of getting it out there, and we have to look a little bit harder for it. But I suppose it's easier now to find out whether it's true or not than it was then, because all you had was weeks and months before you could do anything to find out the truth of the matter. It was real difficult for them, and which I suppose it's easier then than it is now to just ignore it and say, well, if I can't do anything about it, I'm not going to be concerned.
Yeah, I think, Ray, your point's so well taken, because back then the newspapers were intentionally biased. That was the whole point. And since that time, our media, our reliance on news has changed. And as a result, the news organizations have changed their approach. So you're right, nothing new under the sun, but we just need to be more aware, and we need to be our own fact checkers, because it used to be that newspapers would have offices full of individuals, or at least a couple of individuals devoted to checking the facts. And now, not only are there no longer the offices, they're no longer the people doing that, but there's so much more information being published out there.
Yeah, you look at CNN and Fox News, those are prime examples of just influencing public opinion, but people who watch Fox or CNN are pretty much that way anyway. I don't know of too many people that go back and forth between those two or the other sides to really check things out.
Well, and a lot of that actually ties in with a question Rosie had asked in the chat. So as we're looking at different news sources, as we're trying to do our fact checking, Rosie had asked if there's something called search engine bias. And there actually is. So all of the data that is collected on us builds this profile. And this profile really, it follows us around. And so if I, tend to look for news sources, that are, lean more this way or more that way, the more I'm looking at those, the more it's going to direct me that way as well. So as an example, my husband and I, we have some differences ideologically. That's a nice way of putting it. He and I will actually search for the same thing, and we can come up with completely different sources based on, what kind of information we look at on a regular basis. So yes, there really is a search engine bias. What it does is it just kind of keeps reinforcing kind of where we are with things. It's just another kind of confirmation bias.
Do you change, or rather, do you delete your temporary internet files on a regular basis?
I do. There are times that I will use, actually more and more times I'll use the incognito browsing, where it's harder for websites to track me. Absolutely, Hugo, you can reset cookies. I'm also a big one that a lot of people will do. You'll see them pop up on Facebook a lot. You know, what gemstone are you? What day of the week are you? And every time you're putting that kind of stuff in, you're giving more information about yourself away that then gets put out there. It gets kind of merged into this big conglomerate of information about you, and it helps shape the information that you're presented with.
So don't loan your laptop out to anybody, right?
I certainly wouldn't.
They may put their personality in with yours, and you really got a problem.
Right. I spent a lot of time years ago just trying really hard not to let them build this profile about me. And so at one point, you know, advertisers thought I had like 7 kids and I had, you know, this small zoo of animals in my house. I had a dog at the time and 2 grown kids, but you know, all of the kids that they thought that I had were like under the age of 4. And it was crazy because you can mess with that data. But at the same time, you're messing with the information that you get. So that's a whole nother topic there. To use an incognito browser, most browsers, I see that's a question that we got. Most browsers actually do have that setting. You can go into the menu on those. And then there are dedicated browsers like DuckDuckGo and things like that.
One concern that I had.
New topic being born here, a new workshop topic. So let's keep the questions coming. Go ahead.
One concern I had is that you'll see a political advertisement and they say, this candidate voted to raise taxes, which is probably a true statement. The person's been in Congress for 30 years, and at some point, they probably voted to raise taxes. But it's how do you get past these isolated things that may be true, but they're blown all out of proportion for the point of that advertisement or the point of the article or the point of the website.
I mean, that is the perplexing problem, isn't it? When we see these messages repeated and repeated and repeated, how do we get past that? Do any of our presenters want to maybe share, especially based on the particular perspective that you brought into our discussion today?
I think I didn't present, but I did help put this together, and it is a very interesting point. How we look at information is always going to be complex, because you know humans are complex. I guess as a follow-up question to better answer, is there anything specific you're looking for in terms of like explain if you're wondering about how something like that might work, or if there's this particular thing that you've seen in the world that you're curious about why that happens? I can probably talk to that.
Well, I guess my thought was it's the political ads usually that I've seen, and I'm sure that there's a grain of truth, but how would you get past that? I mean, you can look at who's funding the ad, or you know, maybe there's a website that gives a more balanced view of the candidate in terms of what they voted for or what they didn't vote for. I guess I'm looking for a source of more information rather than just that particular ad or that particular website.
Sure. I'll turn on my video so it's easier to talk. I think the main takeaway would be that advertisements are always going to be very targeted, and they want you to take something away, no matter whether it's political or or otherwise, even just some like a product advertisement. So a lot of the time it requires footwork and putting in extra work. I don't know if I hesitate to give one all-round source for the truth, because a lot of the time it comes down to finding multiple viewpoints and verifying from multiple perspectives, which I know it's annoying. I wish I had an easier answer.
I have an easier answer for this one.
Anthony?
If you're talking about voting records, those are public information. They're recorded on .gov websites, and you can just put that person's name in a search bar. And this is the case that say, don't look for multiple angles. You're going to get one side that's the truth and one that's a lie or a falsehood. And in between that is just a half truth. So yeah, you can just look up public voting records. It's congress.gov. Or whatever state congress.
Sure. I mean, I think, and that's good advice, Anthony. It can be, some of those websites can be tough to navigate, especially if you're looking for a person's record on like a very specific policy. You can look and see how they voted, but that doesn't tell you why they did that, right? So that can be tricky to find. But Anthony, your point is well taken. The public voting record, it's public, so you can look up that as an option.
There's also a PolitiFact where they are, I hope I have that right, they will fact check some of these claims, both in advertisements and in articles or in statements that politicians make. Factcheck.org is another one. And we'll have on the Ames website a list of those resources that you can use to check statements.
I think Audrey might have had another question.
I'm going to keep it brief because I know we don't have a whole lot of time, but I have three things. First off, in response to Linda, I'm not sure if this is what she was asking, but I personally can get very overwhelmed with all of the information out there. And I thought one of you guys said when we started this, that part of what I have to recognize, I'll speak for myself, is what I can and can't control. I can't control how the internet works per se. I can't control other people. I can't control all those different things. So this is why all I can control is my own reaction to things and my own knowledge base, which is why this has been so awesome for me, is to get some additional information. The more educated I become, the easier it is for me to fact check. And the second thing I wanted to say is I have a list of like more topics for you guys. Like, could you do the history of journalism, or navigating the information age, or how do I know a journalist is trustworthy or factual? And then the other topic that came to mind that I've heard bits and pieces of, but I'm really appreciating but would love more, is the tips and tricks on your computer, like tech savvy navigating the internet and news sources. So I think really my message with that is I hope you guys do something else. I am so grateful you did this today. I have been wanting something. I live in Ames, but not in college anymore, but this has been incredibly informative, and I'm really glad you've done it. And then the last thing is yes, I will do that. So the last thing was, I was thinking of an example that I think I'll just speak for myself again, but the whole COVID-19 stuff that's been going on in Iowa. I've got the governor who I try to watch. There's places on Facebook. There are people I trust, people I don't. There's so much statistics. I'll just say, there's one person who in the Ames group frequently posts things, and it's clear she's very intelligent and knows her stuff, but I can't understand it. It's so intense and deep and stuff. And I think that's just a great example of we're all trying to figure out how to navigate this, and it becomes very challenging. I just accept it as hard. It's a challenge to know what to listen to and what not to. And so the mindfulness, I just love today. Thank you very much. I'll stop.
Thank you, Audrey.
Thank you, Audrey. I'll add to your list of possible workshops. We had a great example of misinformation that we didn't even get to share, that was homegrown right here at Iowa State University, and one of the facilitators was directly involved. And he can share it better, and we don't have time to go through it all, but long story short, something that he said in a YouTube video ultimately ended up as a medical term used in a medical textbook. So just something kind of flippant that he had said, Xander had said, made its way all this distance and never was questioned or challenged or checked. So that's another workshop for another day, but I promise you it's a fascinating story, and he tells it really well. So with that, I see we are nearing the end of our time. I hope we were able to answer everybody's questions. Excuse me, if we were not able to, some of us are, I know I'm happy to stick around as needed, or I'm happy to share my email to have conversations moving forward. Thank you, Audrey, for your comments, and to all the participants in terms of encouraging us to do more workshops like this. We would love to see that happen, and we appreciate you spending some of your Saturday here. So with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Ebby to wrap us up.
Thank you. And I'm just going to advance my slides a little bit here. Okay, I just want to direct people's attention to the Ames Public Library website. There is a Facing Facts website that we created to kind of supplement the materials and content that's being covered here. So it's amespubliclibrary.org/facing facts. And so there's some materials there, and we will be adding to them some of the things that we mentioned post discussion. So you can check it out there. Okay. All right. So I just would like to thank again our partners for making today's programming possible, especially Julie Rosa and Ryan Ditchfield for helping us to kind of wrangle everyone and get the facilitation going. I'd also like to thank Sherry Bergeffer, Crystal Jewell, Anthony Miller, Rachel O'Donnell, Abby, Xander, Tyler, Hugo, Jessica, our facilitators, just for coming together to make this possible. And last but not least, I'd like to thank Susan Gent for her tireless efforts to bring all the pieces together to make for today's presentation. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for the idea.
Yeah. And thank all of you, of course, for coming out today, spending part of your Saturday with us, and just recognizing how important this is to, the vitality of our community.